ETFs are one of the easiest yet best overall ways for nearly anyone to invest in the stock market and build wealth over time. And as far as Vanguard's ETFs, in my opinion, they have some of the best options available in the market. And so the four that I'm about to mention are considered index funds because they track particular stock market indexes, which means they are passively managed, super cheap to own, they create a very well-diversified portfolio, and have historically done very well. Now, I'll mention more on this later in the video, but I decided to run a Monte Carlo simulation of 1,000 samples using a portfolio of just these 4 ETFs, and the results showed that the portfolio is expected to outperform the S&P 500 over the next 10 years. Of course, the past doesn't determine the future and nothing's guaranteed, but after all the hours of researching, investing, and creating all the content that I do, I strongly believe that these 4 ETFs are among the best overall options in the market to own for life. Everyone's opinions will be different, but to get straight to it, let's first go over the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF with the ticker VTI. Now remember that with ETFs, you can purchase them on nearly any platform that you invest on, similar to buying any ordinary stock, so you don't need a Vanguard account, like you would if you wanted to buy their mutual fund version, that is VTSAX. But when it comes to a total stock market index fund like VTI, this is an investment I believe everyone needs to have as a foundation to their portfolio. And I say that because this fund allows you to gain access to roughly 3,600 different US stocks that range from large, mid, to small cap size companies, diversified across both growth and value styles. So by investing into this fund, you can easily gain exposure to nearly all of the publicly traded US companies, so if the US economy were to continue growing over time, then so would your investment. And so to break it down even further, VTI is made up of roughly 72% large cap size companies, 19% mid cap, and then the last 9% towards small cap. You can also see the percentages for each based on whether they are considered to be value, core, or growth oriented companies. And largely because of that, the technology sector currently makes up 33% of the entire fund, with consumer discretionary, financials, healthcare, and industrials thereafter. Now, a huge reason I am such a fan of strong index funds like VTI is because over time, the markets will change, and if you were to bet all of your retirement savings on one company, you could be in for some serious trouble. But even with all this change and uncertainty, the index commonly used as the standard stock market benchmark, that is the S&P 500, shows that the average annualized return from 1928 to November 2024 was just over 10%. Now, if you didn't know, the S&P 500 contains strictly 500 of the largest US-based companies, so it's not the same as VTI that has small, mid, and large cap size companies. So because of that, the median market cap for each company in the S&P 500 is $284 billion, where for VTI, that shows a lower number at 204. But between VTI and an S&P 500 ETF that through Vanguard has the ticker of VOO, there's an 87% overlap between the two, so if you are looking to invest into the broad US economy, you may want to pick one over the other, which I made an entire video on if you want to check it out after this video. But realize that a 10% annual return for close to 100 years is very assuring for long-term investors. So let's say that you invest $583 per month, that is $7,000 per year, averaging that 10% return. After 30 years of consistently doing this, you could end up having over $1 million portfolio. And if that were in a Roth IRA, that could be completely tax-free once you reach the eligible age of retirement, that is 59.5 or above. And not to mention, but VTI has averaged a 12.3% annual return over the past 10 years. Besides that, as I mentioned earlier, these ETFs are super cheap, and this one specifically has a 0.03% expense ratio, which means every $10,000 that you invest, you are charged $3 per year in fees. And do know that this expense is automatically taken out of the fund over time. It's not something that you have to pay separately. But if you were to get an actively managed fund where professional fund managers pick and choose the investments, it could easily cost you between 0.5% to 1% of an annual fee, which can add up significantly over time. In fact, from the example I mentioned earlier, a cheap index fund like VTI, after 30 years, could end up costing you $6,000 in fees. But if it were an actively managed fund that charged a 0.75% expense ratio, that would end up costing you $150,000 in fees, resulting in a portfolio just under $1 million. Plus, it's a known fact that picking stocks is very difficult, and even a blindfolded monkey throwing darts at a financial newspaper could select a portfolio that would do just as well as one's carefully selected by experts. And in fact, one of the best investors of all time, Warren Buffett, said the best way to own common stocks is through an index fund. But moving on from there, the next ETF is the Vanguard Small Cap ETF with the ticker VB. Now this fund has an expense ratio of 0.05%, which is $5 per year in fees for every $10,000 that you have invested, which is slightly higher than VTI, but this fund is not intended to be the foundation of a portfolio, and the difference is super small. But with VB, this ETF seeks to track the CRSP US Small Cap Index, which measures the investment return of small cap size stocks. This fund specifically has 1,364 stocks in the fund, with top companies you may or may not have heard of, such as Williams-Sonoma or DraftKings, that each of these companies contain only a very small percentage of the entire fund, which the industrials sector makes up the largest portion of the fund, with consumer discretionary and financials thereafter. And if we compared it to VTI that has a median market cap of $204 billion, the small cap VB has a median market cap of $8 billion. Now this fund over the past 10 years has averaged an 8.59% annual return, which is obviously lower than VTI, but the biggest reason I've been adding more exposure to small cap stocks lately is because I came across a research study by Paul Merriman on a 4-fund portfolio where he analyzed a portfolio that included small cap blend and small cap value stocks on top of large cap ones would have actually outperformed the S&P 500 over a 50-year study. In fact, the difference came out to be 12.2% of an annual return when compared to the S&P 500 that was 10.6%. And even just a 1% difference has a huge impact on your future outcome, where he shows that an initial $100,000 in the S&P 500 would have grown to roughly $15 million, where the 4-fund portfolio would have grown to $32 million. Not just has this historically outperformed the S&P 500, but looking through Portfolio Visualizer, data shows that since 1972, the small cap index as a whole has averaged an 11.41% annual return when compared to the large cap index that has averaged 10.75% per year. But no one knows what the future holds, and I do believe that gaining additional exposure to small cap stocks would only improve the diversification of a portfolio and still offer the potential opportunity to see strong growth. But knowing that, let's now go over the number 3 ETF, that is the Vanguard Growth ETF with the ticker VUG. Now this fund has a 0.04% expense ratio, which is $4 per year in fees for every $10,000 that you invest. But what's neat about this fund is that it tracks the CRSP US Large Cap Growth Index that is meant for you to gain exposure solely to the nation's largest growth stocks, where the index primarily selects the companies that exhibit higher price-to-book ratios and higher forecasted growth. As you can see, this fund is tailored solely toward large cap growth style investments that contains only 180 companies, and the median market cap of the companies in the fund is $1.7 trillion. But knowing that, the top companies in the fund consist of Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia, but now you can see that they have a large weighting toward this fund, being 13% for Apple and 10% for Microsoft and Nvidia. And largely because of that, this fund has 57% of the entire fund solely towards technology stocks, with 19% thereafter in consumer discretionary. Now with the tech exposure, this may seem to have more risk, but there are many other sectors included in the fund, and they would automatically be adjusted over time if things were to change. So understand that by owning a fund like this, there is opportunity for great reward, because if you just look at the past 10 years alone, VUG has averaged a 15.09% annual return. But please be aware that data shows since 1972, the large cap growth index, when compared to a total US stock market index, actually computed relatively the same results. Now, as far as large cap growth ETFs, there are 2 other strong alternatives to consider that are SCHG or QQQM, which I made an entire video on if you want to check it out, but recently I've been really starting to like SCHG. With that said, the last ETF on my list is the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF with the ticker VXUS. Now this ETF has a 0.05% expense ratio, and it seeks to track the FTSE Global All Cap excluding the US index, which means it provides broad exposure across developed and emerging non-US equity markets. The fund currently has over 8,500 different stocks, with the top ones being Taiwan Semiconductors or Alibaba, where each of these top companies contain only a small percentage of the entire fund. But knowing this, the largest sectors in this fund consist of financial services at 21.9%, with industrials and technology thereafter, which of all the holdings, roughly 40% comes from Europe, 26% from emerging markets, and 25% from the Pacific, where you can see the top countries consist of Japan at 15%, the UK, China, Canada, and many more thereafter. But the reason I'm mentioning this ETF last is because I personally only recommend a small percentage of a portfolio to go toward international stock. Not just has international stock underperformed the US significantly by returning a 5% annual return over the past 10 years, but for many of the large US companies, they also have significant exposure outside of the United States, where you can see Nike alone only has 43% of its revenue coming from North America. 15% alone comes from Greater China. But just because recently the US has outperformed international stock, there have been numerous times where international has outperformed, and I'm not saying the timing looks interesting, but I do believe that having a small exposure to international stocks over time would provide additional exposure to a portfolio without having much of an impact. And do know that since 1986, US stocks have significantly outperformed international stocks from an average of 10.85% to 6.77%. So if you are interested in getting international exposure with an ETF like VXUS, I personally recommend a very low percentage. And for me, I typically want to keep it under 5 to 10% of an entire portfolio. With that said, let's now go over a quick portfolio sample using these 4 ETFs. For the analysis, I've mostly used Stock Rover, which if you want to check it out, you can get a 14-day free trial, and I'll have a direct link to that linked in the description below. But the first thing to know is that I'm just going to use a generic portfolio example. This does not mean you have to do this, but the portfolio I used consists of 55% VTI, 25% VUG, 15% VB, and 5% VXUS. And so right here, you can see the exact regions for the entire portfolio combined have 95% towards North American stock, where the S&P 500 is nearly 100%. And if we look at the sectors that make up the entire portfolio, it is very similar to the S&P 500, and the differences between each are very small. But what I like to see here is that with the 4 Vanguard ETF portfolio, there is more exposure to small cap stocks, where the S&P 500 does not have any. In fact, even if we look strictly at VTI, there's only about half of the small cap exposure and less overall growth than the 4 Vanguard ETF portfolio. And if we look at the Monte Carlo simulation of 1,000 samples over the next 10-year period, adjusting for inflation and contributing $1,000 a month into the portfolio, it calculates that the average end value after 10 years is estimated to be around $200,000. And if we compare the overall returns between this portfolio and the S&P 500 of 1,000 samples going forward, it shows that this portfolio is expected to achieve an 8.2% annual return compared to 7.4% with the S&P 500 adjusted for inflation. And even in the 50th percentile, you can see the average annual return for this portfolio is 7.4% compared to 6.6% for the S&P 500. But please understand that I'm not saying this is the best approach, even though it may sound great. Large cap stock has performed very well recently, and over the past 10 years, this exact portfolio would have averaged an annual return of 13.8% when compared to solely the S&P 500 that was 14.35%. And crazy enough, comparing the portfolio to solely 100% VTI, the past 10-year annual returns came out to be the exact same, but no one knows what the future holds, and you have to make your own financial decisions. Not just that, but looking at the past results, you can see some of the portfolio's best and worst months, where 2 months grew over 10% and 1 month was down 15%, right around the start of COVID. With that said, if you want to check out other relevant videos that I created, or my free learning guides such as my index fund cheat sheet, I'll have them linked in the description of this video. And while I mention it, don't forget that if you want to try out Stock Rover, you can get a 14-day free trial, and if you want to start investing on a new platform, or check out other top financial products, I'll have direct links in the description below for you, which depending on the ones that you get started with, I may earn a commission for it, which is greatly appreciated. With that said, I hope you found value in this content, and as always, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and notifications button for future content like this.